I never should have let him drive me home. That was the first mistake. The second was letting my mind wander to places it had no business going while I sat in the passenger seat, watching his hands grip the wheel. It had been a long evening, a family dinner at my daughter's house, where everyone played their roles to perfection, smiling, nodding, pretending everything was as it should be. My daughter Emily had always been a planner, an organizer, someone who thought every detail through before making a move. She had done the same with her marriage, picking the right man, the right house, the right life. Mark was steady, reliable, the kind of husband any mother would approve of for her daughter. Except, I had stopped seeing him that way a long time ago. It started as a whisper of curiosity, the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence in his presence. He wasn't flashy, didn't demand attention the way some men did, but he had an easy strength about him. Something controlled, contained. He was polite but firm, considerate but not overly sweet. And when he looked at me, really looked at me, there was something in his eyes that made my stomach tighten in ways I hadn't felt in years. So when Emily had too much wine and decided she was staying over at her friend's house for the night, Mark had offered to take me home. The rest of the family had gone their separate ways, leaving the two of us alone in the driveway, the cold night pressing in as he unlocked the car door for me. I slid into the seat, my body tense, my mind racing. "Appreciate the ride," I said, my voice smoother than I expected. "Of course," he replied, starting the engine. "Wouldn't want you driving this late." We pulled out onto the quiet streets, the hum of the tires filling the space between us. I told myself to think of anything else, Emily, the dinner, the way my son-in-law had laughed at some joke my nephew made. But my focus kept drifting back to him, the way his jaw flexed, the way his forearm tensed when he shifted gears. I pressed my legs together. It had been too long since I felt truly wanted, since I had been touched in the way that made my skin burn. My ex-husband had been indifferent for years before we divorced, and the lovers that followed had been fleeting distractions, men who were eager but never quite enough. I had almost forgotten what it was like to be caught in something dangerous, something thrilling, until now. We hit a red light. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "You all right?" I nodded. "Just tired." Long night. I studied him in the glow of the dashboard. His wedding band caught the light as his fingers tapped idly against the wheel. I should have looked away, but I didn't. "You and Emily seem happy," I said, testing the waters. His mouth twitched, something between a smile and something else. "We are." A simple answer, a safe one, but there was something in the way he said it that made me press just a little more. "You ever wonder?" His gaze flicked toward me. "Wonder what?" "What it would be like if life had taken a different turn." The light turned green. He hesitated for half a second before pressing the gas. "Sure," he admitted. "I think everyone does." I exhaled slowly, my pulse quickening. "Me too." Silence stretched between us, thick, heavy. My house wasn't far, just a few more turns, but suddenly the drive felt unbearably short. I wanted more time, more space to explore the tension building between us. My fingers grazed my knee, and I saw his gaze flick toward them before snapping back to the road. I shouldn't have enjoyed that as much as I did. We pulled onto my street, my house looming in the distance. My heartbeat drummed against my ribs. If I got out now, that would be the end of it. A quiet car ride home, a moment of curiosity that never amounted to anything. But if I lingered, if I let myself step just a little closer to the edge, I wasn't sure I'd be able to stop myself from falling. He pulled into my driveway and put the car in park. His hand stayed on the wheel. I let the moment stretch, waiting, wondering if he'd say something, if he'd give me an opening. "Thanks for the ride," I murmured, my voice lower than necessary. He turned to me, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something hot, something barely restrained. I reached for the door handle, pausing just long enough to let the anticipation build, to give him the space to make a move, if he wanted to. And then he did. His hand shot out, resting gently on my wrist, stopping me. A jolt of heat shot through me at the simple touch, his skin warm against mine. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, his voice quiet, controlled. I turned to him fully, holding his gaze, letting the air between us crackle with something unspoken. "I think you already know the answer to that." His jaw clenched. A war raged behind his eyes, a battle between restraint and something much darker, much more thrilling. I didn't move. I wanted to see what he would do next. If he would pull away, step back into the safety of his life. Or if he'd let himself slip just for a moment, just for long enough to shatter the boundary neither of us should have been crossing. His grip on my wrist tightened just slightly, a flicker of hesitation, before his fingers trailed up my arm. Slow, deliberate. My breath caught, my body going rigid with anticipation. My skin burned where he touched, the air thick with something neither of us could name. I knew I should leave. Get out of the car, close the door, pretend this never happened. But I didn't. Neither did he. The air inside the car felt charged, thick with something dangerous, something neither of us wanted to name. My skin was hot where his fingers had touched, the ghost of his grip lingering long after he had let go. A rational part of me whispered that this was my moment to step out, to walk into my house, to close the door and pretend none of this had happened. But I stayed. Mark hadn't moved either. His hand had drifted back to the wheel, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his knuckles tightened, like he was gripping the steering wheel just to keep from reaching for me again. "You should go inside," he said, but his voice was different now. Lower, strained. I wet my lips, my breath unsteady. "I should." His eyes flicked to my mouth, and I felt my stomach tighten. He was still fighting it, still trying to convince himself that nothing was happening here, that he hadn't been looking at me like that all evening, that I hadn't noticed. I reached for the door handle again, but this time I moved slow, giving him the space to stop me again if he wanted to. And he did. His hand closed around my wrist again, firmer this time, and when I turned my head to look at him, he was already leaning in. My breath caught, my pulse hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. He wasn't touching me, not yet, but I could feel the heat of him, the way his breath mixed with mine in the small space between us. "This is a bad idea," he murmured. I swallowed, my throat dry. "I know." His fingers slid up my arm, his touch slow, deliberate. Every nerve in my body was on high alert, desperate, burning with anticipation. And then he kissed me. It wasn't tentative, wasn't hesitant. It was firm, filled with the tension we'd both been ignoring for too long. His lips were warm, insistent, and when his hand tangled in my hair, I let out a sound I couldn't hold back. Something inside me snapped. I turned toward him fully, my hands finding the front of his shirt, gripping the fabric like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. He tasted like the whiskey he'd had earlier, rich and intoxicating. I let myself fall into it, let myself forget for just a moment that this was my daughter's husband, that this was wrong in every possible way. But Mark wasn't pulling away either. If anything, he was the one deepening the kiss, his hands roaming, his body pressing against mine. His control was slipping, and I wanted to see how far he'd let it go. The sound of a car passing on the street outside made us freeze. Reality came crashing down around us, and we pulled apart, breathless, our chests heaving. I searched his face, waiting for regret to settle in, for him to tell me this had been a mistake. Instead, he reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my face. His fingers lingered, and his eyes burned into mine. "I should go," I whispered, but neither of us moved. His gaze dropped to my lips again. "Yeah." Silence stretched between us, thick, unyielding. I knew that if I got out of the car now, that would be the end of it. A moment of weakness, something we'd pretend never happened. But if I stayed, if I let this go further, I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to stop myself. And deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to. Mark let out a shaky breath, his hand dropping from my face. He was struggling just as much as I was. I could see it in the way his body tensed, the way his fingers clenched at his sides like he was forcing himself to stay still. "We can't do this," he said, but his voice held no conviction. I nodded slowly. I know. Still, I didn't move. Neither did he. The seconds ticked by, stretching endlessly between us. And then, as if something inside him had snapped, he reached for me again. This time there was no hesitation. His hands were firm as they pulled me closer, his mouth urgent against mine. I let myself melt into him, let myself be swept up in the sheer intensity of it. My hands found his shoulders, then his hair, and the way he groaned against my lips sent a thrill down my spine. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a warning bell rang, but I ignored it. I didn't care about the consequences, not in this moment. All I cared about was the way he made me feel. The hunger, the heat, the undeniable pull between us. He tugged me closer, his fingers digging into my waist. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out everything else. I didn't care that we were still in his car, that anyone could walk by and see us. All that mattered was him. His lips trailed down my neck, his breath hot against my skin. I arched into him, gasping at the sensation. Every nerve in my body was alive, tingling, desperate for more. "Tell me to stop," he murmured against my skin. I couldn't, I didn't want to. Instead, I whispered the only thing that mattered. "Don't." Mark growled low in his throat, his hands tightening around me. His restraint was crumbling, and I wanted to see what happened when it was completely gone. The sound of my phone vibrating in my purse sent a jolt through me. I stiffened, and he pulled back slightly, both of us panting. Reality came crashing back in, sharp and unrelenting. My heart was still racing, my body still aching for him, but I forced myself to reach for my purse. The screen lit up with Emily's name. Guilt hit me like a slap to the face. I stared at the phone, my breath catching in my throat. Mark watched me, his expression unreadable. But I could see the same guilt flickering in his eyes, the same realization sinking in. I silenced the call. Neither of us spoke, and just like that, the moment was broken. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling. "I should go." Mark nodded, but I could see the struggle in his eyes, the same battle I was fighting within myself. I reached for the door handle again, and this time, he didn't stop me. As I stepped out of the car, the cold night air hit me like a bucket of ice water. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to steady my breathing, trying to ignore the way my body still burned from his touch. I turned back, meeting his gaze one last time. He looked like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. He just watched me, his expression dark, conflicted. I closed the door and walked up to my house, my legs unsteady beneath me. I didn't look back. The night should have ended there. I should have locked my door, gone upstairs, slipped beneath the covers, and let sleep wash away the heat still clinging to my skin. But as I stood inside my dimly lit foyer, heart pounding, breath unsteady, I knew that sleep would be impossible. I moved through the house in a daze, kicking off my heels, shedding my coat, my dress. The house was too quiet, too empty, and my mind refused to silence the memory of Mark's touch. I could still feel the weight of his hand against my waist, the heat of his breath on my neck. My fingers brushed against my lips, still swollen from his kiss. I should regret it, I should be ashamed. But I wasn't. I let out a shuddering breath and walked to the kitchen. My hands shook as I poured myself a glass of wine, seeking something, anything, to calm the storm inside me. The deep red liquid swirled in the glass as I lifted it to my lips, the taste rich, bold, yet it did nothing to settle me. I leaned against the counter, staring out into the dark backyard, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. And then, a soft knock at the door. I froze, my grip tightening around the glass. No one should be here this late. My heart leapt into my throat as I set the wine down, moving cautiously toward the door. Another knock, firmer this time. I swallowed hard and peered through the peephole. "Mark." My breath hitched. Every rational thought screamed at me to walk away, to pretend I wasn't home, to let this be the moment where we both came to our senses. But my body had other ideas. My pulse quickened, my fingers itched to unlock the door. I opened it without thinking. He stood there, his expression unreadable, the dim glow from the porch light casting sharp shadows across his face. His hair was slightly disheveled, his breathing uneven. He had driven here, straight from my driveway, and I knew in that moment that I wasn't the only one struggling with what had happened in that car. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. I stepped aside, and he walked in. The door clicked shut behind him. The tension between us thickened, growing heavier with each passing second. He was close enough that I could feel his body heat, could smell the faint traces of cologne clinging to his skin. My throat was dry. "Tell me to leave," he said, his voice rough, strained. I didn't. I couldn't. He exhaled sharply, like he had been hoping for a different answer. His fingers flexed at his sides, his jaw tensing as if he were fighting some internal battle he was destined to lose. "This is wrong," he murmured, but there was no real conviction in his words. I stepped closer, closing the distance between us. "Then why are you here?" His gaze darkened, flickering to my lips before meeting my eyes again. "Because I can't stop thinking about you." A tremor ran through me. I should stop this. I should walk away. I should say something that would make him leave before we crossed a line we could never uncross. But I didn't. Instead, I reached for him. The moment my fingers brushed against his, he was on me. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me against him, his mouth claiming mine, with a desperation that made my knees weak. I gasped against his lips, my hands fisting in his shirt as he backed me against the wall. Every touch, every kiss was electric, the kind of need that burned so fiercely it obliterated everything else. His hands roamed over my body, mapping every curve, every inch of me. I arched into him, reveling in the way he made me feel. Alive, desired, wanted in a way I hadn't been in years. "Tell me to stop," he whispered against my skin. I shook my head. "Don't." His mouth found my neck, his teeth grazing my pulse point, and I moaned. My body was no longer my own. It belonged to this moment, to him. Somewhere deep down, I knew there would be consequences, that this would change everything. But in that moment, I didn't care. I wanted him, and he wanted me, and nothing else mattered. I woke up before the sun, tangled in sheets that smelled like him. My body still ached, a lingering reminder of the choices I had made in the dark. The house was quiet, but I wasn't alone. Mark was there, his steady breath filling the space beside me. I turned my head slightly, careful not to wake him, and studied the sharp angles of his face, the way his lashes rested against his skin, the quiet tension still etched into his features even in sleep. This was the moment I should have felt regret, shame, guilt, but all I felt was warmth, a deep satisfaction humming beneath my skin. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet cool against the hardwood floor. Pulling his shirt around me, I made my way to the kitchen. The clock on the wall told me it was just after 5. Too early to call this morning, too late to call at night. I stood by the counter, gripping the edge of the marble as I tried to steady my thoughts. Everything had changed. I wasn't naive enough to believe we could just pretend this never happened. But what did it mean now? Where did we go from here? A deep voice broke through my thoughts. "You left me alone in bed." I turned, startled, to find Mark standing in the doorway. His hair was a mess, his jaw shadowed with rough stubble. He hadn't bothered putting on clothes, only the sheet wrapped loosely around his waist. I swallowed hard. I needed a moment. He walked toward me, his expression unreadable. "Do you regret it?" I met his gaze, steady and sure. "No." His eyes darkened, something unreadable flickering across his face. "Then why do I feel like you're about to run?" I inhaled sharply, forcing myself to hold his gaze. "Because I don't know what happens next." Mark reached out, his fingers brushing my wrist before he laced them through mine. His touch was grounding, steadying. "Neither do I." I exhaled, my shoulders relaxing slightly. "Then what do we do?" He tugged me closer, his other hand coming up to cradle the side of my face. We take it one step at a time. My breath caught as he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a slow, lingering kiss, the kind that didn't ask for anything, but gave everything. A sharp knock at the front door sent a jolt through both of us. We froze, our eyes meeting in a silent exchange of panic. I stepped back, my heart hammering. "Who?" "Emily," he murmured. Ice ran through my veins. My daughter, Mark's wife. The knock came again, more insistent this time. My stomach twisted as I hurried to the door, barely able to keep my hand steady as I unlocked it. When I swung it open, Emily stood there, her arms crossed, her brow furrowed. "You're up early," she said, her eyes scanning my face, searching. I forced a smile. "Couldn't sleep." Emily shifted on her feet, glancing past me into the house. "I tried calling you last night. A few times." My breath caught, but I forced my expression to remain neutral. "I must have left my phone on silent." She studied me for a long moment before nodding. "Mark never came home." My stomach dropped, but I didn't let it show. "I'm sure he's fine." Emily sighed, rubbing her temples. "I swear, sometimes I don't know what's going on in his head. He's been so distant lately." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Marriage is complicated." She let out a dry laugh. "You can say that again." I nodded, biting the inside of my cheek. "Do you want to come in?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I just wanted to see if you'd heard from him. If he calls you, can you tell him to call me?" My stomach twisted. "Of course." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Thanks, Mom." "Mom!" The word hit me like a punch. I forced a smile as she turned to leave, my hands gripping the doorframe so hard my knuckles turned white. As soon as she was gone, I shut the door and pressed my forehead against it, sucking in a sharp breath. My chest felt tight, my heart hammering against my ribs. Mark appeared behind me, his hand resting on my shoulder. "What did she say?" I turned to him, my voice barely a whisper. "She's looking for you." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "This is—" "I know." I pressed my fingers to my temples. "We weren't thinking." He studied me for a long moment before stepping closer. "Yes, we were." I swallowed hard. "Mark." His hands gripped my waist. "I don't regret it." Neither did I, but that didn't mean the walls weren't closing in. I looked up at him, my mind a tangled mess of emotions, of decisions I wasn't ready to make. But one thing was clear: this wasn't over, not even close. I spent the rest of the morning pacing my living room, my body still humming with the aftershocks of everything that had happened. My phone sat on the coffee table, screen dark, a silent reminder of the storm that was brewing. Mark had left not long after Emily did, slipping out the back door with a lingering look that told me he didn't want to go. But we both knew he had to. I ran my fingers through my hair and let out a shaky breath. This couldn't last. We had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and now the weight of it was beginning to settle in. It was only a matter of time before Emily started piecing things together. I had spent years convincing myself that I was the kind of woman who would never do something like this, that I could keep myself in control, play by the rules, never let desire override my sense of right and wrong. And yet here I was, my body still aching from Mark's touch, my mind still drowning in the memory of his mouth against mine. The doorbell rang, sharp and insistent, pulling me from my thoughts. My pulse spiked, fear and anticipation colliding as I moved toward the door. When I opened it, I expected Emily, expected her face twisted with suspicion, her voice sharp with betrayal. But it wasn't Emily. It was Mark. He stepped inside without a word, closing the door behind him. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and something about the way he looked at me sent a fresh wave of heat through my body. I should have told him to leave. I should have reminded him of what was at stake. Instead, I let him press me against the wall, his hands gripping my hips, his breath hot against my ear. I can't stop thinking about you. I exhaled, my hands fisting in his shirt. Mark? I don't care anymore. His mouth found mine, his kiss deep and consuming, like he was trying to drown himself in me. I let him. I let myself get lost in him one last time, knowing full well that we were pushing our luck. We barely made it to the couch before we were tangled in each other again, our bodies desperate, our hands greedy. Every touch was reckless, every kiss edged with something dangerous. But the moment was short-lived. Because just as we lay there, breathless and tangled, a voice shattered the fragile illusion we had built. Mom? Everything froze. I turned my head slowly, my blood running cold. Emily stood in the doorway, her expression blank, her eyes dark and unreadable. Panic surged through me. Emily! She shook her head, holding up a hand to silence me. Don't. Mark sat up, his face pale, his hands trembling. Emily, I said don't. Her voice was sharp, cutting, a blade that sliced through whatever excuse either of us might have tried to offer. The silence that followed was suffocating. My chest tightened as I searched her face, desperate to find something, anything, that suggested she could forgive me. But there was nothing, just cold, hard betrayal. I came to apologize, she said finally, her voice quiet, detached. For being distant, for assuming the worst about you. I thought maybe we could talk. Maybe I was overreacting about Mark being distant. But no, I wasn't, was I? Tears burned the back of my eyes. Emily, I never wanted to hurt you. She laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. But you did. She turned to Mark, her lips curling into something cruel. And you? God, I thought I knew you. Emily, please, Mark tried, stepping toward her. She flinched back, shaking her head. Don't, just don't. She took a breath, steadying herself. You both made your choice. Now I'm making mine. I swallowed hard. Emily, please don't do anything rash. She laughed again, shaking her head. You don't get to tell me what to do. And then she was gone, the door slamming shut behind her. Mark and I stood there in the aftermath, the weight of what we had done pressing down on us like a boulder. This wasn't some secret we could keep anymore. This wasn't something that would just go away. Mark turned to me, his face stricken. What do we do now? I exhaled, my chest tight with the kind of regret that couldn't be undone. I don't know. But I did know one thing. Nothing would ever be the same again.